Welcome and welcome back to Equal Rights and Justice.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, the historic reality of Juneteenth, the popular story suggests that enslaved Africans in Texas remained unaware of emancipation until Union troops arrived in Galveston in June of 1865. How accurate is that narrative? To what extent were enslaved people already aware of the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, and broader political developments beyond Texas?
Well, first of all, let me say I support the concept of Juneteenth, a paid federal holiday, although it's observed sporadically by employers from the Atlantic through the Pacific. But as your question suggests, there are some limitations to the traditional understanding of Juneteenth. That is to say, when the Emancipation Proclamation of the Lincoln government was issued on January 1st, 1863, Texas was in rebellion against the U.S. government. Texas was not under the jurisdiction of the U.S. government. And so, therefore, the Emancipation Proclamation did not necessarily have any import in the state of Texas. It's also fair to suggest that the traditional understanding also serves to elide the culpability of the enslaving class because certainly they knew about the Emancipation Proclamation. And if slavery continued through June 1865 after the surrender at Appomattox in Virginia by the Confederate forces in April 1865, well, then certainly this was an attempt by the enslavers to continue to profit from this diabolical system. What I'm seeking to suggest is that when the U.S. government forces showed up in Galveston on June 19th, 1865, they were seeking to prevent something more dastardly. What I mean by that is that you have to somehow coordinate your understanding of Juneteenth with your understanding of Cinco de Mayo, which is a holiday marked by the Chicano Mexicano population in particular. That is to say, their revolt and rebellion against foreign rule, a puppet leader, Maximilian, who at that point was cooperating with the Texas enslavers because the idea was to reverse the abolitionist decrees in Mexico, which had been rendered decades earlier by a president of African descent, speaking of Vicente Guerrero. And that particular edict by President Guerrero led to a secession of the then Mexican province of Tejas or Texas from Mexico, spearheaded by Sam Houston, Stephen F. Austin, and other so-called Anglos who then ostentatiously implanted their names on leading cities such as Houston, Texas, Austin, Texas, cities we know all too well. And so the idea, as noted, was to continue this dastardly system under a joint condominium of Maximilian and the enslaving class in Texas. But alas, that did not succeed. And interestingly enough, on June 19th, 1867, you had the capture and trial, admittedly a rather pro forma trial, and then execution of Maximilian, which helped to guarantee, to the extent that it was possible, that slavery would be buried. I chose my words carefully because, as you probably know, even after June 19th, 1865, actually up until this very day, you have forms of enslavement. Some might call it wage theft. There are other names as well. And in Texas in particular, and throughout Dixie, you had the convict lease system, whereby black men in particular would be detained and arrested and then hired out by the state to work for former enslavers on some of these very same plantations that their ancestors were forced to work on. And that convict lease system existed for decades. And in fact, just recently in Sugarland, which is now a suburb of Houston, there were graves that were uncovered that contained the bones and cadavers of many of these black men who were forced to work in a kind of neo-slavery, slavery by another name, to coin a phrase. And now there's a process being established of creating a memorial to them and for their unpaid labor. I should also say that the overthrow of Maximilian and the thwarting of the plan to continue slavery, traditional slavery, in Texas, was a sterling example of black-brown unity that needs to be studied more intensively and carefully. That is to say that the U.S. government forces were heavily comprised of black men in blue wielding weapons, and of course the Mexican forces who helped to overthrow Maximilian were working in league with these black men in blue. And that is the kind of example that we need to understand and we need to study as we mark June 19th in 2026, as we mark Juneteenth in 2026 in the midst of yet another counter-revolution that is now being executed from the White House, seeking to overthrow diversity, equity, and inclusion, affirmative action, seeking to turn civil rights law on its head, seeking to toss out a significant percentage of the members of the Congressional Black Caucus, tossing them out of the House. We need to understand how the limited victory over slavery in 1865 was limited because the ghost of slavery, the descendants of the enslaving class, continue to wield significant influence to our detriment.
You know, one of the things that has hit me about the aura, if you will, of Juneteenth, there's a passivity, if you will, that is the underlying thing of people somehow waiting without being participants in their own liberation from the inception of the capture and abduction of people from Africa. They're there waiting for the liberatory process. And Juneteenth, no less so. While it is celebratory, it seems to take the edge off of the reality of the liberation struggle and the Black radical tradition, which has followed through since the inception of the abduction to people in this land. And I wonder if you can just talk about some of that in a historic context of people of African ancestry being the originators of their own freedoms and these struggles, and perhaps taking that into what I think is one of the most important and understudied periods in the history of this country, and that is Black political empowerment during Reconstruction. That's a lot to unpackage, but I can't think of anybody better than you to try to put some meat on that bone.
Well, what needs to be understood is that the current political and economic landscape of these United States of America has been shaped unavoidably and inescapably by the struggles of the indigenous population and the African population. This goes back to the 1520s, approximately a century before the celebrated date of 1619, when the Spanish, from their perch in the Caribbean, dispatched enslaved Africans to what is now the Carolinas in order to establish a foothold on the North American mainland. But the enslaved Africans, as was their tendency and their wont, rebelled and joined the indigenous population in chasing the Spanish back to the Caribbean, that is to say, to the extent that they were not all liquidated. This example of African indigenous collaboration and unity was a hallmark of the struggles and of the history that helped to create ultimately the United States of America. I mean, if you look at the precursor of 1776, the revolt spearheaded by enslavers such as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Patrick Henry, where they tossed out London. The precursor of 1776, of course, was the so-called Glorious Revolution in England in 1688. What was at issue there, in no small measure, was the fact that the Royal African Company was under the thumb of the monarch. And the Royal African Company, as its name suggests, was in control of the African slave trade, which was dispatching labor primarily at that point to Barbados, to Jamaica, etc. What happens is that the rising merchant class wants a piece of the action, and therefore they revolt so that they could get part of the profit of this fabulously lucrative African slave trade, whereby you can invest $1 and get $1,700 in return. And there are those today who might sell their firstborn for such a return on investment. In any case, the so-called Glorious Revolution led to the clipping of the wings of the monarch. Today's King Charles, for example, is the legacy of the clipping of said wings. And that led to the deregulation, if you like, of the African slave trade, with the merchants descending upon Africa with the maniacal energy of crazed bees, manacling and handcuffing every African in sight, dragging them across the Atlantic to work for free, particularly on sugar plantations, sugar being not only a way to sweeten your tea, but also seen, believe it or not, as a kind of miracle drug as well. This created, in some ways, the foundation for the rise of the kind of capitalism that we know today, because with the profits that were garnered, there were more ships that could be built by working class people in the British Isles, getting wages, that those wages could then be recirculated into the British economy. And needless to say, the ships could be used to transport settlers across the Atlantic and Africans, enslaved Africans, across the Atlantic as well. What happens in the following century is, once again, you see the question of slavery at the heart of another so-called revolution, this in 1776, as aforementioned, enslavers in the vanguard. But what was at issue was not only free labor provided by enslaved Africans, but also seizing the land of the indigenous, because London had tired of expending blood and treasure to wage war against the indigenous so that the land could be turned over to these enslavers like George Washington. If you mentioned my book, The Capital of Slavery, and in that book, I was able to look at the last will and testament of one George Washington. And when he passed away, he was one of the largest landowners on planet Earth. But of course, this land was mostly land that was purloined from the indigenous population. And so, what was at issue in 1776 is something that has been at issue in regard to many profound struggles, that is to say, land and labor. And we know that the Black population disproportionately did not engage in class collaboration, which has been the hallmark of settler colonialism, and in fact helps to explain the ascendancy of one Donald J. Trump in November 2024. That is to say that the Black population fought tooth and nail against their enslavers. And what tends to happen when you fight a war and you do not prevail, that you and your descendants will continue to be pulverized and penalized forevermore until you're able to turn the tables, which our brothers and sisters in the Caribbean began to do circa 1791 as the ink on the vaunted Bill of Rights was just drying. I'm speaking of the onset of the Haitian Revolution, culminating in 1804, igniting a general crisis of the entire slave system that could only be resolved with its collapse, helping to inspire slave revolts not only throughout the Caribbean, but also on the North American mainland, principally Gabriel's Revolt in Virginia in 1800, Dame Mark Vesey's revolt in South Carolina circa 1821, where Vesey, a so-called free man of color, had the bright idea of not only revolting, but leading an escape of enslaved Africans southward to freedom in the Caribbean. And then, of course, there's the Nat Turner Revolt of August 1831. And so as we gear up, at least some gear up, I should say, to mark the 250th anniversary of this erstwhile slaveholders republic, we should not lose sight of the reality of the struggles from below that helped to shape and form the landscape, nor should we lose sight of the kind of class collaboration between and amongst the settlers across class lines who united in order to seize the land of the indigenous and to stock that land with the bodies of enslaved Africans in order to produce profit on which they would then share. And what's interesting, if I may digress for a moment on the Native American question, is that even those Native Americans who sought to assimilate, I'm speaking of the Cherokee and the southeast quadrant of what is now the United States of America, states such as Georgia, for example, many of them sought to assimilate, although it was contested. That is to say, many of them became sedentary agriculturalists, many of them converted to Christianity, developed an alphabet for their language, producing newspapers, many of which you can still read, and some of whom became enslavers themselves. But under the misleadership of then U.S. President Andrew Jackson, they still had to go. Of course, Andrew Jackson being a favorite president of the current occupant of the White House. And they were forced to embark on the Trail of Tears, heading west to what was then called Indian Territory, now today's Oklahoma, where many indigenous groupings from that part of what is now the United States, including the people we refer to as the Creeks, the people we refer to as the Seminoles, they were also forced to evacuate, if you like. And many poor Europeans, or I should say some poor Europeans, fresh off the boat, could then move into their mansions. The then vacant mansions of Cherokee elites, for example, thereby helping to embody the so-called American dream. And if you understand that kind of history, you can understand the class collaboration that obtains today, whereby many of the 77 million who voted for Donald J. Trump in November 2024, they don't have a mumbling word to say about Elon Musk becoming a trillionaire and taxing that misbegotten wealth in order to create better life outcomes. Indeed, minimally for the 77 million, they're more concerned, many of them, about overturning DEI, overturning affirmative action, eviscerating the Voting Rights Act of 1965, tossing out members of the Congressional Black Caucus, etc. And I think that our movement and many of our leaders and intellectuals, they would better serve reality if they stopped making excuses for the 77 million and instead would connect what's happening today in 2026 with what happened centuries ago, indeed.
You're listening to Equal Rights and Justice. I'm Mimi Rosenberg with the great, often described by another historian, William Loren Katz, as a national treasure. That is Dr. Professor Gerald Horne. We're going to take a momentary break and return with Dr. Horne looking at Juneteenth and the distinction between legal emancipation and actual freedom.
To turn your head away, 'cause what I'm gonna talk about, nobody wants to be without. Makes no difference who you are or what color you happen to be, as long as you're alive. Be one of your needs. I'm talking about freedom. I'm talking about freedom, yeah. I'm talking about freedom. I'm talking about freedom, y'all. Freedom for you and me. And every living thing that breathes. You're gonna have to say, my, oh my, oh my, oh my. And all of the water that's in the sea, oh, how it flows so very free. Makes no difference who you are or what color you happen to be. This has got to be one of your needs. daddy, your little sister needs freedom, y'all. Freedom to do as I choose to do. Come on, y'all, give me some freedom. I want some freedom. Come on, come on, come on, give me some freedom, y'all. Give me some freedom. Freedom, 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 freedom.
Talking about freedom, Sly Johnson could just as easily have played and who'll pay reparations on my soul by Gil Scott. We're back with Dr. Gerald Horne. Now, even after Juneteenth, and Dr. Horne's mentioned some of this already, formerly enslaved people faced black codes, racial terror, debt peonage, sharecropping, disenfranchisement, and segregation. Now, I'm interested in how we should understand the distinction, Dr. Horne, between legal emancipation and actual freedom as we are surrounded by appropriate, in many ways, celebratory activities around Juneteenth, but oftentimes without the depth of understanding of the struggle that created that federal recognition of that date. But your thoughts about legal emancipation and actual freedom and where Juneteenth stands on that road to talking about freedom.
Well, I think we need to recognize that the drowning of Reconstruction in blood by terrorist white supremacists spearheaded by the Ku Klux Klan in the period roughly beginning in 1865 with formal emancipation, that in a sense, this was predictable. And I think it was predictable in the sense that those who have come to have a more intelligent understanding of the founding of the slaveholders' republic circa 1776 would not necessarily be shocked nor surprised by the fact that when the correlation and alignment of forces lined up to allow for the overthrow of that particular setup, that there would be a movement, a counter-revolutionary force to try to somehow restore the status quo. Recall that after the U.S. Civil War is commenced in the spring of 1861, the U.S. government was not necessarily prevailing, particularly after the Battle of Antietam along the Maryland-Pennsylvania border in 1862. And it was at that point that President Lincoln had the bright idea of issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, which would have its import mainly in areas where the U.S. government did not prevail. That is to say, in areas where the states were in rebellion. And that allowed for the recruitment of approximately 200,000 black men to fight on behalf of the U.S. government. And that really turned the tide against the Confederate States of America. And it's captured in one of the more recent Will Smith vehicles. I'm speaking of the film Emancipation, which is well worth viewing. On the other side of the coin, keep in mind that the Confederate States of America was a classic class collaborationist enterprise, and the CSA men who fought on behalf of slavery, many of them were not slave owners, but many of them felt either that that's history that system, excuse me, undergirded by white supremacy was well worth preserving, and or they thought that at the end of the day, they could become enslavers themselves and therefore profit from the shedding of blood between 1861 and 1865. And that brings us to the question of reparations, because, as noted in my book on Washington, D.C., the enslaving class in the District of Columbia were compensated when their right to property in the bodies of Africans was nullified, for example. And that, minimally, you can say, sets a precedent for the kind of reparations that are being demanded today from the other shore, from the descendants, by the descendants of enslaved Africans. And you may have heard the news that the tentative steps towards reparations, for example, taken in Evanston, Illinois, or now the U.S. government is attempting to nullify that particular initiative. But once again, this will not be met with indifference on the part of those who believe in equal rights and justice, because as we speak, unfolding in Accra, Ghana, is an important summit on reparations, seeking to compensate the areas of Africa that were ravaged and savaged by the unlimited African slave trade, not to mention the descendants who were victimized during that inglorious period, and many of whom, of course, are now tuned into this program. And so I think that what we need to realize is that at the end of the day, although we should mark these milestones like Juneteenth, we should recognize that it is perpetual and constant struggle that helps to guarantee that these milestones have meaning. And to that end, I should mention that on Juneteenth, I'll be speaking in Brooklyn at Sisters Place in Bedford-Stuyvesant beginning in the early afternoon on some of these issues. And likewise, in the current issue of The Nation, the New York-based publication that came into being during the midst of the struggle against slavery and its aftermath, that I have a review essay that examines some of the issues we're discussing this morning.
And I will give you more information on where Dr. Horne will be speaking tomorrow, and certainly intend to be in attendance at that presentation. Since you mentioned the Nation article, I wonder if you can give us a synopsis of that. I just came across it thanks to you forwarding it to me yesterday, and haven't had a chance to fully digest it. But you referenced it, and when you reference something, I take it seriously. The import and thesis of that article, Dr. Horne.
Well, it's a review essay based on a recent book by Pulitzer Prize winning historian Joseph J. Ellis, who in many ways has been the main shaper and framer of what many have come to understand about 1776 and the men who spearheaded 1776. But in his latest book, he revises many of those understandings that has helped to create this remarkable consensus from left, right, and center that 1776 was this great leap forward for humanity. He, of course, goes back and looks at how and why it was that most Black people did not stand with George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, et cetera. And then he also couples that with an examination of the Indigenous question. That is to say, how the Indigenous wound up losing their land from the Atlantic to the Pacific as a direct result of 1776. And so this is important for a number of reasons, given his prominence in shaping the current consensus. It's akin to, as I say, the Pope reconsidering Catholicism, for example. Likewise, I analogize the current moment, although I don't do that in the article, but I'll say it now. I analogize it to what happens following the publication of Du Bois's epic text, Black Reconstruction, in the mid-1930s. Recall that up until Black Reconstruction, the historical consensus, amongst many at least, was that Reconstruction was a failure. Its failures supposedly are captured in that disgusting, despicable Hollywood blockbuster Birth of a Nation, whereby corruption of Black legislators is seen as the hallmark of that period of democratic promise from 1865 going forward. And what's happening now is that there is a kind of jailbreak from the fabrications of 1776, not unlike what happened in the mid-1930s when Du Bois began to publish and released his book, Black Reconstruction. So I would say that right now, as we approach the 250th anniversary of the erstwhile slaveholders republic, it's the equivalent of being in the United States, say 1937, 1938, when Du Bois's book has been published and is just beginning to reshape consciousness. You not only have Joseph Ellis's book, but many in your audience are probably familiar with Nicole Hannah-Jones and her 1619 project, where she had the audacity and temerity to suggest that when slaveholders revolted against London, that slavery may have been at issue. In the review that you note in The Nation, I also make reference to other contributions in other areas. I mean, for example, there's the Canadian Broadcasting, South African Broadcasting BET co-production of the multi-part docudrama, The Book of Negroes, which has a classic scene from Lower Manhattan after the triumph of the rebels, where the Black heroine confronts George Washington himself, for example, as she wonders when the freedom he is now celebrating will be extended to herself and those like herself. And then there's the movie Belle, Belle, by the British Ghanaian auteur Ama Asante, starring the British South African actor Gugu Mbatha-Raw, which gives the backstory of Somerset's case, an important case from the early 1770s in London, when the authorities refused to send an enslaved African back to Virginia, which did not go down very well with the enslaving class. So we are in a very important moment right now, because as Ellis says in his book, what caused him to reconsider his hagiography of the founding fathers, as they are called, was the ascension of one Donald J. Trump. Because you have to be able to draw a connection between the past and the present. It's silly, if not naive, to act as if there's a great wall between the past and the present. That is to say, there was this glorious revolt in 1776 leading to the supposed expansion of democratic liberties. But then in 2026, you have the spectacle of the DC fat boy, and I'm not speaking of Billy Stewart, I'm speaking of one Donald J. Trump, and his rampant corruption and the bloody barbarity that he's staging on the grounds of the White House just this past Sunday. The corruption, the market manipulation, the insider trading, the bombing of Iran, the impending threats against Cuba. And so you have to be able to have a history that sheds light on the present. A lot of the history today, it's irrelevant to the present because you have to strain to draw a connection between the past and the present. And right now, that simply won't do.
I want to just pick up on that in the sense. So many historians describe the overthrow of Reconstruction, and I think rightfully so, none more brilliantly than W.E.B. Du Bois and Black Reconstruction, but the overthrow of Reconstruction as one of the greatest counter-revolutions in U.S. history. And how the forces that defeated Reconstruction really have shaped the racial order that followed, and I think really paved the way for the Trumpian MAGAism era to build on. Your thoughts on that and the significance of not having really reconciled and dealt with, we like symbolism versus substance, the overthrow of Reconstruction, which is still, I think, the period that we're living in.
Well, the overthrow of Reconstruction and that bloody period following 1865 not only solidified Dixiecrat rule, white supremacist rule, the rule of the then reactionary retrograde Democratic Party, the weakening of the then anti-slavery Republican Party. And I should mention a couple of points in that context. One, if you look at the class configuration of Reconstruction, you get a glimpse of the kinds of political problems that we face today. What I mean is that those few Black people who could vote in the South and generally nationally were voting for the Republican Party, the anti-slavery Republican Party, the party of Lincoln. The Republican Party is the ship, all else is the sea, said the late Frederick Douglass. And they were in a kind of coalition with Northern Capital, for example, whereas the Democratic Party was a party principally of the white South and also to a degree of the white working class in places like New York City, for example. And that particular class configuration mirrors, in a sense, the class configuration of today's Republican Party, whereby with the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, you saw a mass exodus of many Euro-Americans across class lines from Lyndon Baines Johnson's Democratic Party into the ranks of the Republican Party, where they still continue to reside. And I think what we need to recognize is that in order to shake up that kind of reactionary system, you oftentimes need to extend the battlefield. You need internationalism. But alas, with the anti-Jim Crow movement reaching a kind of apex in the 1950s, you had many of the Black liberals and liberals generally who tossed overboard those to their left, led by the late, great Paul Robeson, and then cut a deal whereby there would be these anti-Jim Crow concessions. But those anti-Jim Crow concessions are basically resting on a foundation of sand, which we now see clearly with the rise of Donald J. Trump. Now, the other point I would mention is that it's oftentimes lost sight of that the period following 1865 is a period of significant genocide against the indigenous population in terms of losing their land. I'll be publishing another book in a few months dealing with how this manifests in the Pacific Northwest, in what is now Oregon and the state of Washington, beginning in the 1850s, for example, and culminating in this genocide. And I don't think you can begin to understand the history of this country nor the current moment that we face without understanding, without having a fundamental understanding of genocide. Because if you have a progressive movement, which is sadly the case, that tends to sweep genocide under the rug and celebrate the creation of this so-called republic while ignoring what befell the indigenous population, not only ignoring what befell the indigenous population, but failing to recognize that the kinds of civil liberties that are celebrated as represented in the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, that in some ways this is a kind of combat pay that is doled out to the settlers to attract them across the Atlantic from these feudal baronies of Western Europe and from the kingdoms of Western Europe. And so you should not celebrate the Bill of Rights in a vacuum. You should see it as part and parcel of this entire historical process that led to the overthrow of indigenous polities, culminating perhaps in Hawaii in 1893, and also what befell the Black population as well with the overthrow of Reconstruction and the drowning of that democratic promise in blood.
And we want to deal with the coda now as we remind people that we are speaking with the great, great historian, the people's historian, the Dr. Gerald Horne, who you will be able to and must take advantage of it. It's of historic significance to listen to Dr. Horne, and he will be speaking on Juneteenth. And today at the event that is put in place by the December 12th movement with their institution, Sisters Place, and that is in Brooklyn. It will be at 12:30 p.m. That's 12:30 p.m. to 3 p.m. at the Pentecostal Evangelistic Outreach Church, which is 102 Jefferson Avenue in Brooklyn. That's the Pentecostal Evangelistic Church, Jefferson Avenue, 102 Jefferson Avenue in Brooklyn, and it's the organizer is Sisters Place, and a donation is requested if you are able. And there will be a book signing there as well with Professor Gerald Horne, who will sign his latest work for you, an absolutely imperative event to take place. So the coda, Dr. Horne, for us, you've referenced some of it, but when you look at the long arc of struggle from slavery, from Juneteenth to Reconstruction, and then the anti-lynching campaigns, and then the upheaval of the civil rights movement, and the then Black Power liberation movements, and today's battles over voting rights and democracy and the clawing back of DEI, not to mention the decimation of affirmative action, and equality. What gives you a hope, and how do we focus and move forward from here?
Well, I think we need to recognize that internationalism is the missing link with regard to the struggle of many of us, not of all of us, because you mentioned the organizers of this event tomorrow, Juneteenth, in Brooklyn, the December 12th movement. And these activists are taking to the streets, as I understand it, on June 20th as well, in solidarity with socialist Cuba.
Absolutely.
Which obviously will be moving into the forefront of the headlines so that Mr. Trump can distract from this ignominious defeat he's just suffered in Iran at the hands of the Islamic Republic. And I think that in the grand sweep of history, we need to recognize that other than the struggles of the oppressed ourselves, what has helped to be the locomotive of progress and the locomotive of advance has been our ability to link up with the like-minded across the borders, across the oceans, across the seas. I think I could go back to where I began, for example, in the 1520s, when we were struggling against the Spanish and prevented them from establishing a foothold in what is now the Carolinas, which helps to create an opening for the English to then invade that part of North America decades later. But in the interest of time, I'll fast forward to the Pan-African Congress of 1945 in Manchester, England, called together by Du Bois, but also featuring Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana. We also recognize that politically, our understanding of how we reach these shores has been illuminated magnificently by Trinidad and Tobago's Eric Williams in his book Capitalism and Slavery, a founding father of TNT, or the work by the late, great Guyanese historian Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And so what happens, to reiterate, beginning in the 1950s, is that our movement, to an extent, was detached from international currents in return for anti-Jim Crow concessions. But that bargain, if you want to call it that, has not worked out very well, as we are now in the midst of a counter-revolution hell-bent on reclaiming the concessions that were doled out reluctantly over the past 70-odd years or so. And so when the December 12th movement takes to the streets around the question of Cuba, they're not only in solidarity with the Cuban Revolution and solidarity with the struggling masses of the island, they're also trying to reframe and reconceptualize our struggle right here on these shores. And that's why I'm so happy to be in their midst and in their presence tomorrow, June 19th, in the People's Republic.
Facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.
Power to the people.